Welcome to the Texas Water Journal webinar series. The webinar today is Microplastics and Microfibers in Texas River Sediments by Rebecca Owens. Let me tell you a little bit about Rebecca. Rebecca is the chair of the Department of Engineering and Physical Sciences at Tyler Junior College in Tyler, Texas, where she has taught geology courses since the fall of 2012. She earned her Ph.D. in water management and hydrological sciences and a master's of science also in geology from Texas A&M University. She and her husband live in Rusk, and they have 5 dogs and 6 cats, which sounds exhausting. And before I turn it over to you, Rebecca, let me just say that the Texas Water Journal is a 501c3 peer-reviewed journal, which is sponsored by the Texas Water Resources Institute at Texas A&M, the Bureau of Economic Geology at the University of Texas at Austin, and the Water and Environment Research Center at Texas Tech University. And so today, if you have questions, please enter them into the chat. And as Rebecca gets to the end of her presentation, we'll start the Q&A at that point. And so I'm going to mute my microphone, Rebecca, and turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Todd, for having me. Thank you, everybody, for joining me today. I'm excited to get to present. This has been sort of a passion project of mine for a few years now. So let me see if I can share my screen now. And how this works out. Okay, so I hope that's visible for everybody. So this was a project that I actually began back when I was working on my doctoral dissertation that involved sampling a lot of river sediment. And it was actually from that I became aware of sort of this growing field of, or this growing concern about microplastics in the fluvial environment. And so I decided to start testing that sediment that I had sampled. And so the main takeaways that I want to present that I put in my paper and that I want to present today is that obviously these are things now that are very prevalent throughout the Earth system. And my focus is on the fluvial environment. But I mean, this is something that's even making headlines in non-scientific publications about the prevalence of microplastics in the Earth system and also in our own bodies. And so today I'm going to focus on how we see that accumulation in fluvial systems. And one of the points that I like to sort of investigate is how that can lead to changing geomorphic adjustment of these river channels. And so that can happen sort of through some ecological impacts and the implications of that on the biogeomorphology of river channels. And then we also see potentially some hydraulic impacts itself on the geomorphic adjustment. So I'll start with just, the fact that these things do exist and their prevalence throughout the fluvial system. There have been lots of other papers, and I didn't cite all of them in this presentation. They're all in my paper that the Water Journal was nice enough to publish for me. But there have been lots of previous studies that have detected microplastics really throughout the entire freshwater system, from the bed sediment to the suspended surface sediment to lakes, estuaries, lagoons, and then increasingly in the freshwater organisms. And so that has posed a lot of health concerns, of course, as it pertains to those producers and then consumers accumulating the microplastics, in their system. And then potential concerns if humans then consume those animals and those plants. And so, like I said, that's been really widely studied and continues to be widely studied and presented upon. So I'll touch on some of those studies that have come out recently, and then also talk about, another effect, which is how this potentially could change the behavior of river channels. So a little bit about where I was studying. Like I said, this was sort of an offshoot from my doctoral dissertation, and that focused on the effects of urbanization on the geomorphology of river channels. And so in that project, I looked at 3 different rivers in Texas, specifically upstream and downstream of urban centers, their respective urban centers. So one of them was the Brazos River in and around Waco, Texas. And you can see I had about 13 sampling sites on the Brazos River. We began upstream of Waco, and then you can see we moved just downstream. By the time you get to sampling sites about 7, mostly 8, 9, and 10, that's when we're just downstream of urbanization. I also looked at the Colorado River upstream and downstream of Austin, Texas. I will say, since Austin is so big, to really get upstream of the effects of urbanization, you can see on that map there on the left, I had to go pretty far. We went all the way nearly up to Marble Falls. We were up around the Schaefer Bend recreation area, and then took some samples downstream of Austin. And then I did the Trinity River upstream and downstream of Dallas. And so when you look at the map, I realize that as you're looking at sampling sites, basically 5 through 9, it still looks like you're very much in the urban center of Dallas, but that's actually moving into the the Great Trinity Forest there, which is a really beautiful urban forest that's there in the Dallas area. So the channel itself is still in a fairly natural environment, as much as one can be expected. It hasn't been built up the way that a lot of Dallas has been. So what I did from that, I took those sediments from each of those sites. It was roughly a quart of river sediment or so. Took them back to the lab. I alternated between the lab that at that point I still had access to at Texas A&M and my geology lab at TJC, and dried out each of that sediment and then sieved it. I sieved it for about 20 minutes each, to varying sample sizes, going down to 75 micrometers up to, I think it was 4 millimeters was as large as I got. So when it was all said and done, I had over 100 samples, 150, I want to say, samples of sediment all sieved out to these different sizes. And then at that point, I took it back. This part I did do fully at TJC in the geology lab there. And we centrifuged it in a solution of sodium iodide, and did that because that is a little bit denser than water. And so the heavier stuff naturally sank, and you had the lightweight material that you would reasonably expect plastic to be part of to be floating up at the surface. And then I was able to just sample that surface material. And that was what I investigated for, the presence of microplastics. And to be clear, this was very much a visual inspection after I separated it by density. It was looking at it under a dissecting microscope and just visually looking for things that looked like they could be made of, plastic or synthetic materials. When you're looking at it visually, the main things that you're looking for, first of all, are the colors. Anything that's jumping out of you that it's not a color that you would regularly see out in nature. Obviously that's one that's a red flag for you. And then also sometimes the shape is a good tell. A lot of natural sediment, has a little bit of roughness and whatnot to it, even this rounded fluvial sediment. But with plastic material, they tend to be sort of unnaturally, we can say, smooth. And so that was what I was using to determine what was probably plastic. And so this is what I found for each of those sites. And one thing that it jumps out to me, because I've looked at these maps enough, it may not be obvious to people they're seeing this for the first time, but those sites that were coming just after the urban centers are where you really see a jump in the amount of microplastics. So the Brazos River was right around 9 and 10 that we saw that. Again, the Colorado River was interesting. As large as the river is and as many people live around it, did not find as many suspected microplastics there as I did in the other rivers. But still, where you do see the peak was as you get past Austin. And then one of the other biggest effects of urbanization came in Dallas, as the Trinity River gets just past the major urban part of Dallas and starts going into the Great Trinity Forest. And so I sort of tried to color code that and really make that point on this slide, just showing where urbanization was relative to those sampling sites on these graphs. Now, I will say most of the microplastics that I found were actually fibers. And forgive me for looking down at my notes, but I wanted to make sure I get those number right. About 93% of the particles that I found were fibers. And as you read the literature, people define what makes it a fiber a few different ways. Generally, the simplest way is that it's smaller than most microplastics, and to be sort of more specific, it has a width that is about 1.5 orders of magnitude shorter than its length. So that's what we call fibers. And the fibers are coming from all kinds of places. Some of it is wear and tear off of tires and things like that. A lot of it, though, is from textiles that are moving into our water systems. And this is showing the size distribution as well of the different fibers and microplastics that I pulled from these samples. And so this would be really a function of each river and, its own discharge, its own velocity. And also just how all of the different rivers are sort of managed. They all have different dams on them that were affecting them. If not a dam, in that part of the Trinity that I was looking at, I hadn't yet reached a dam, but there was at that point still a standing wave that had been constructed. I believe that's been taken out since then. But there were all kinds of things there that were sort of changing the flow of sediment. And so that probably affects, also the distribution of the sizes of the fibers and the other microplastics that were found. So all of that to say, this was really just sort of supporting lots of other studies that have been done. We know that the microplastics are out there. That part wasn't really a surprise. As I said before, there have been a lot of studies talking about the prevalence of microplastics in the natural environment. And so the reason then that we worry about that, or maybe worry is the wrong word, but the reason that that's probably notable to people or noteworthy to people is because there is a question of how that might be affecting our health as humans and also the ecology of these landscapes where we're finding them. So these are some of the recent headlines, sort of recent. I have the recent ones down at the bottom. Some of the recent headlines coming out about the bioaccumulation of these microplastics. And the ones that are really catching a lot of attention, I think for very good reason, is that we're now very aware that these are showing a lot of prenatal accumulation in humans, not just in animals that are living in these freshwater environments, but it's very clear that they're growing in human babies even before birth. And so the thing about microplastics, and again, this is all from prior literature, and I have the full reference list that I used there in my paper in the Texas Water Journal. But these are the sort of things they come through us through consumption, but also through respiration and also just through absorption through our skin. And then once they are in the body, we now realize that they're really effectively transported just through circulation throughout the body. And it causes all kinds of effects, some of which we've witnessed and some of them we've sort of seen in lab testing on animals. But we know that for one thing, it can trigger basically an allergic reaction because our bodies sometimes, recognize them as a foreign entity. And they also can pose sort of what we call the Trojan horse effect, where they're sort of carrying with them other chemicals or other diseases perhaps that are dangerous to the human body. And then we also have the chemicals that make these plastics, and this is one that I know gets a lot of attention as well in different publications. We know that, some of these chemicals are endocrine disruptors, and so they go in and they affect the endocrine system. But as I said, we know from looking at our more recent studies that this is starting even before birth for humans. We're seeing microplastics transported from the placenta to the fetus. We know that this exposure and this accumulation is starting in utero. A lot of this statistics you see are from the 2022 paper by Ragusa and others. And we have found it in, as I said, in the placenta, in newborn meconium. That was actually found at even higher concentrations than in adult stools, in breast milk and in blood. So again, it's well established, and it has been for several years now, that they're accumulating in humans. And that comes with a bit of concern about what that could mean for health. And as I said, we know that the the additives that are added to microplastics, as I said, specifically the bisphenols and the phthalates, are endocrine disruptors, and specifically they are estrogen mimickers. And so has the potential of confusing the response of those hormones, as I said, in the host organism. And then specifically in relation to the prenatal accumulation, some of the concerns that sort of focus on that are that, at least in animal studies, this isn't something that, as far as I have read, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, I haven't seen any studies where this has been seen in human studies yet, but in animal studies, we have seen high exposure to plastics in pregnant and nursing organisms been correlated with alterations to the neuron and brain tissue structure. And then you also have, as you can see, some changes to the placenta. And so a lot of, concern about the potential of this. A lot of what we're seeing, though, is that, with humans, most of us are dealing with low levels of exposure over a very long time. And so that's different than some of these lab tests on animals where they're seeing high levels of exposure over a short time. And so it's difficult to say for sure if the health concerns in one group are equivalent to those of the other. But it is something that is actually still, being studied. So like I said, my focus on this, because there are just so many papers out there already talking about the potential for human health, I'm interested in the river channel itself. And so I was interested in the ecological implications. And one of them, one of the concerns is that all of these concerns that we see about the health impacts on humans, the same thing is true of the freshwater animals and even the freshwater plants. And so I have several papers that I reference that talk about the effect on the overall freshwater ecosystem. But we know that the bioaccumulation is definitely a thing. You see that consumption leading to plastic buildup in the digestive tract. And then that has a lot of course, just implications on the health of those organisms themselves. But there's a potential, if this were to continue at a large scale for a long time, this may have an effect on the biogeomorphology of the river system. So right now, I'm not aware of any studies where they're saying, yes, we're definitely seeing this already. But the thing is, we're expecting to see plastic production increase as we go into the future. And with that, we're also seeing some struggles with figuring out how best to recycle plastics. Countries that we used to sort of sell those plastics to recycling are no longer taking our plastics. And so we have this sort of concern, separate but related concern now, of we're introducing more plastic. We aren't really sure how to efficiently get rid of it just yet. And some cities have already started enacting regulations to reduce the amount of single-use plastic that they're putting out, but not all cities have. And so unless something changes very quickly, realistically, we can expect to see more of this plastic accumulation in the river systems as with anywhere else. And so there is a possibility that that may affect the geomorphological processes. So that's what I'd like to talk about now. That's sort of my focus. I'm a fluvial geomorphologist, and so was sort of my interest in all of this. I'll start with the biogeomorphology side of things. And so, in other words, how organisms are driving the geomorphology, or the shape, the structure and shape of river channels, and that evolution over time. Now, with a lot of rivers, the organisms are not as major of an effect as the just inorganic hydrologic processes that are pretty basic to rivers, talking about, shear stress and things like that. But there's been a couple of studies, and I have them cited there, that actually show that in places and rivers where you have very fine sediment, from very fine sand to silt to fine sand, they actually tend to be more susceptible to that modification by biotic factors. And in some studies, that was an even greater impact than those traditional hydraulic factors. So if you are talking about a river that has that finer sediment, this may be a very big part of its adjustment process, the biogeomorphological impacts. So, like I said, we have all these concerns about, the impact of the microplastics on health, and that in turn affects the river biota. This is just showing the sediment sizes from the specific parts of these rivers that I sampled. Now, I'm well aware that if you go to other parts of these rivers, you tend to see different sizes of sediment. But this was showing what I sampled as I was right there around those urban centers. And as I said, or maybe I didn't say specifically, but with Austin and with Waco, both of those had major structures. You had Longhorn Dam, and then you have the weir right there, just downstream of Lake Waco. And so that was really affecting, the transport of sediment in those places. And then up in the Trinity River, that was probably the slower moving river of the three that I looked at. So where I was looking, you notice most of the sediment that I was encountering was in that fine sand range. And so it is reasonable to assume that the effects of biogeomorphology would be pretty pronounced there. This is probably difficult to read now that I'm seeing it in a PowerPoint presentation, but again, it's bigger in the paper in the Texas Water Journal, excuse me. And it's showing you just the major organisms that show some geomorphic influence on those rivers. And some of them are stabilizers, exactly what it sounds like. They work to help stabilize the river channel and reduce erosion, reduce migration of the channel. And then others are destabilizers. So the one that I want to focus on, I'm looking down at my clock, sorry, y'all. I'll try to hurry this along. The one I want to focus on specifically are the crawfish, because we do have quite a bit of that in our rivers. And some of the papers that I'm going to reference are from up north, so they're called crayfish in those, but I'm from Texas, so I'm going to call them crawfish. But we see those, of course, throughout Texas rivers, and they were a major factor in the Brazos, the Colorado, and the Trinity that I was looking at. And they are one of your major geomorphic influences. And so just to focus on those for a second, there's been actually a lot of papers that have focused on crawfish and how they respond to microplastic contamination. And in fact, the Dent paper from 2023 was a really interesting study about crawfish in some rivers in England. And he did a study where he was sampling crawfish and then finding microplastics accumulating in the guts, but what's really interesting is that it was also accumulating in their tails. So the percentage was higher in the guts of the crawfish than it was in the tail, but it was demonstrating the fact that the microplastics are definitely translocating through the entire body. They weren't just going to one place and sitting there. They were moving throughout the entire crawfish. And he found such a strong correlation with the microplastic pollution to the urban centers and to just the crawfish in general that he proposed them as being sort of a bioindicator. So something that can be easily sampled to get a feel for what the level of microplastic pollution is in any specific river. And so I have some other studies that have all been listed there that were done recently where they focused on microplastics in freshwater organisms in general, but they all also specifically looked at crawfish. And they all said the same thing, that yeah, they're definitely accumulating in the tissues and they're causing oxidative stress from what they're seeing. So they're seeing changes to the tissues and the cell lining in the crawfish. So that's just one example. Right. But the point is, and the reason I spend so much time in my own paper and in this presentation talking about the aquatic animals is because these are the types of animals that bear an effect on the geomorphology of the rivers. And we're seeing that they are reacting to microplastic contamination. And so again, if this is to continue, we may in the future see a real effect to how our rivers adjust if we're changing the level of the biogeomorphological agents there. Another group were the aquatic plants, the macrophytes. And it was the same basic thing. Like I said, in the interest of time, I can't go into as much detail as, of course, those studies did. Whereas crawfish tend to be destabilizers, your aquatic plants tend to be stabilizers, but they too are susceptible to this microplastic pollution. We know that they are taken into the plants, they are absorbed onto the surface and taken to the internal structure, just like we see with the animals. And it does cause those changes. We've seen delayed germination, decreased root length, changes to biomass, and changes to photosynthesis. So again, all of that to say the entire ecology of the river system is also being affected by microplastics. The last part of it that I wanted to talk about, because I've not seen as much of this sort of discussed, is the direct impacts on just the hydrologic behavior of river channels. When you're studying the geomorphology of a river, you're looking at things like the Shields diagram and, figuring out like, okay, how much flow can we expect to be required to move sediment of such and such size? And that's all great if you're dealing entirely with natural sediment. But we've had a couple of studies that came out, actually two came out in 2019 that were by the same group, and were both, I thought, really interesting, just showing how, the microplastic or the plastic sediment, we'll even just say getting up even to 5 millimeters across, but the plastic sediment that we're seeing doesn't behave the same way that natural sediment does. And, as you're reading it, it's like, well, that actually makes sense. We should have thought of that beforehand. But they have some papers out that talk about the settling and rising behavior of plastics, and also just how much shear stress is actually required to move plastic sediment as compared to the natural sediment. And what it comes down to is that the density is different. Natural sediment, you can see, has an average density of a little over 2,600 kilogram per cubic meter. The microplastics are, far less. Again, right now, we don't, in most rivers anyway, we don't have a large enough quantity of plastic sediment for this to be making a huge difference on the entire system. But as I said before, as we continue to see plastic accumulation increase, this may be something that in the future we have to really take note of and factor into. The shape also plays a role. A lot of your natural alluvium is round. I mean, river sediment tends to be round. Plastic particles, don't play by those rules. They can be in pellets, they can be fibers. That's most of what I found were fibers. They can be more angular fragments. And so you do actually see some differences in their behavior. And these were some of the images. This is not my image. This came from one of the 2019 papers. And again, I have them cited there at the end. But this is a Shields diagram showing, here's your Reynolds number along the side. Here's the Shields parameter. So basically giving you an idea about shear stress. And really what's notable about these images, the real takeaway, is that most of the plastic fragments or plastic pellets, the plastic sediment in general, they began moving early, far earlier than the natural sediment did. In fact, you notice most of them here are moving in the place that on the graph is considered no motion. So they're moving at a point that traditionally we don't expect sediment to start moving yet. That was especially true with the round fragments as opposed to the pellets or to the fibers. And it's thought that that's because the fibers especially tend to sort of get wedged down in between the natural sediment, and so they don't get picked up quite as easily. But we do see those plastic basically being mobilized far sooner than we're seeing natural sediment mobilized. And so the green dots on here is from the 2019 paper. I really encourage them. Both of them were very good. The red that you're seeing is from a study that was done in 2013 that they cite, and Ballin and his team did some similar experiments, but in those they used a channel bed that was entirely plastic sediment. And so that's, for just making a point and for making these observations, that's really useful, but it's right now unlikely that we're going to find that in nature, thankfully. And so with the other paper, with the 2019 paper, they had the plastic mixed in with natural sediment to simulate more of what you see in rivers today. And so they went through, and I'm looking down, and thankfully I don't have enough time to dissect all of these equations because I don't think I could off the top of my head. But they did go through and sort of worked out some new equations that would be most useful. This is for calculating the settling and rising velocities for plastic sediment. Because again, became very clear that the original equations that have been sort of traditionally used for natural sediment, they don't apply if it is not natural sediment, if it's plastic sediment. And so shape, they found, is a really major factor in this whole thing. As I said, that determines how, that's one of the main things with density that determines how easily it's going to be mobilized as to whether or not it's going to get wedged between the natural sediment that's already there. And so, like I said, that was just sort of the takeaway is, as you're trying to predict, as we are trying to predict the behavior of rivers. And again, that was my sort of focus for my doctorate, was how urbanization specifically makes rivers migrate faster or slower or not at all compared to a natural river. And so if you are a geomorphologist and you are trying to determine how or when a river might migrate, might erode its channel because of the impacts of the sediment, if you have a high abundance of plastic sediment, we can't use our traditional formulas. These are going to be equations that perhaps in the future we may have to look at if we see river systems becoming more inundated with plastic than we currently see them. So in closing, microplastic pollution is ubiquitous in the freshwater environment as it is throughout the planet. And that part, I think, because I said, this has been pretty well established even in non-scientific literature. You see this as headlines now in the news all the time. So, and I'm happy to see that word is getting out even beyond the scientific community. That's potentially concerning because we know that those constituent chemicals potentially can pose a health risk to humans, some beginning before birth. And then for the purposes of studying river systems, like I do, those aquatic plants and animals are susceptible to those same risks, and that creates some ecological questions. And if we continue to see this accumulation, then there is a possibility of the future effects just through hydraulic adjustment of river channels, just because of the difference in how those sediments behave compared to natural sediment. So with that, there's some of my references if y'all care to look at them. That is all I have. Thank you guys very much for listening, and I guess if there are any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer.
So, Rebecca, I've got a question,
Sure.
and while I'm asking this question, if anybody else has questions, you can enter them in the Q&A, I think, unless something's gone haywire, you can do that. Or I guess you could do it in the chat if the Q&A is not working. Uh, but my first question is, I was, thinking about the sampling you did on these three major river systems in Texas. And I was wondering, has anyone uh, done any sampling, or is there any systematic sampling for microplastics and microfibers across all rivers in Texas? I mean, in other words, to me, it'd be very interesting to see if someone could do a study where they've gone ahead and sampled across all the rivers in the state so that you've got this kind of comparison. Um, I guess that would be a one-time deal, and it seems like maybe there should be a more systematic sampling regime. But I'm just curious about that, if anyone's done anything of that nature.
I haven't seen anything across the entire state. There have been plenty of studies, much like mine, where people have gone out for their specific study area. Specifically for Texas, I have not seen as many. As you might see, just worldwide, this has, of course, been a big topic. But I agree with, we need to get, I think, a little more systematic on how we do that sampling, because you read a lot of these different papers, mine included, and we all kind of did it a different way. And then the processing, once you get back to the lab, there's a lot of different ways people do that as well. So yeah, it does need to be more systematic. Absolutely. And yeah, it probably would be a one-time thing initially, but I would be interested to see though, how it does change moving forward, if that could be something probably several different groups or, some young scientists just getting started could devote their entire life, I guess, to studying it over time. Because like even with the three that I looked at, the Colorado River, let's see if I can get back to that slide. The Colorado River around Austin, that was the biggest urban center that I looked at, was around Austin. But it had, was this it? Yeah. But it had the least amount of plastic accumulation in it. And obviously, I would love for somebody to go back and do this themselves and check my work, because this could be user, error or scientist error. But I mean, it was really notable that how few plastics there were for a city that large. And so I think it goes back to, management. And as people are becoming more aware of this problem, I would hope that we start seeing different management practices as time goes on, and that maybe you do see a reduction in sediment, in plastic sediment. The problem is, of course, we don't really know how to get rid of the stuff that's there. And so that's the other part of this, is that if you were to keep sampling it over time, it might be hard to say there's a reduction unless it's just that it's washing farther downstream and getting to the ocean.
So
That,
I've got another question, and we've got in the Q&A a couple folks have said how much they've enjoyed this presentation.
okay,
I
thank
just
you.
want to let you know what those were in the Q&A there. But thinking about the presence of microplastics and microfibers in our bodies, right? Um, you know, and I may be wrong about this, but I'm curious. My assumption is we're mostly getting that from the things that we eat, which have them in them, because I'm guessing, or not maybe guessing, but I'm hoping that our water treatment technology is capable of removing these and is removing these elements, unwanted elements in our drinking water supplies. So can you opine on that a little
Yeah.
bit?
Yeah, one would hope, right? So our water treatment systems, it's definitely a concern. We have different ways that people are trying to remove plastics from water. Um, but it's not anything we've really mastered just yet. And so that's, as I said, that's the other big problem, is that we get these things into the water, into the rivers, wherever it is, and it's not really certain yet how to get it out effectively. And again, but there's nothing really across the board just yet. In fact, wastewater treatment plants, so where they're taking the water and cleaning it up and putting it back into rivers, are actually known to be a major source of microplastics, just because we don't know of a really cost efficient and effective way across the board just yet to really remove these things. And so, at least in some wastewater treatment plants, they're just moving straight through the entire process and back into the river. But yeah, a lot of them for us tends to be, for most of us, tends to be through eating and drinking. In fact, if you drink water from the single-use plastic water bottles, it's actually expected that you're going to have more microplastics in your system than if you just drink tap water. Because although we haven't yet really mastered how to get rid of microplastics from water, we're still doing better at it than what you would get from drinking from just those, cheap plastic bottles, because they are, they're weathering and they're applying microplastics to what we're consuming. Now, there have been studies done, though, in bigger cities around the world. There were some studies out of China where they realized that for people that were living in those major, just metropolis cities in China, they were getting a lot of it through respiration, because you had some that had gotten to the size of nanoplastics that they were inhaling. They were finding it even in just the dust around their homes. So yeah, I think the consumption of plastic is the main one. And so that's why you do see, I'm happy to see more and more restaurants moving away from, the plastic wrapping, the single-use stuff. Um, but we're also getting it other ways as well. And we know that respiration is one of those. And then, like I said, all the recent studies coming out showing that even before we're born, we're already becoming, building it up in our systems.
So you've given me some new ammunition to use with my family about these single use plastic water bottles, which I've completely failed at getting them to not use those. But now I've got some more ammo to use there. So we now have some questions in the Q&A. So let me read the first one, which is from Audrey Douglas. It says, are you aware of any studies or any ongoing research into microplastics in groundwater and the potential transport of microplastics between groundwater and surface water?
Mhm. Yeah, I can't give you the names of the authors right off the top of my head. I apologize for that. But yeah, the groundwater system is another one that people are studying that. There haven't been as many of those studies as you would see with surface water, excuse me, just because the difficulty, of accessing it. But the short answer is yes, that is being done. I'm sorry, I don't have the names off the top of my head, but there are some people that are looking at that. As I recall, it's been really what you would expect. You don't see the contamination as high as you do in surface water. But yeah, that's something that is starting to be quantified as well.
Okay. I've got a question from David Billinger, and he asks, has someone done a study on the quantity and particle size of sediment on how it traps the microplastics?
Oh, interesting. The only ones that I personally have read, and I mean I don't claim to be an expert on this. I just did my one little paper. But this 2019 paper that I referenced a few times by Waldschlager and Schutrump, it was actually this first one. That was not the specific focus of it, but in theirs, they did mix in the microplastics with natural sediment. And so they do include some data in there, just sort of along those lines, because that was the whole point of this specific paper. And you can see it, like I said, if you pull up the paper from the Water Journal, it has the full title and everything there.
All right. You've frozen. Can you hear us?
Just fine.
Okay, now you're unfrozen, I think.
Okay. I'm
Okay,
sorry.
that's all right. That's all right. Those things happen. So now I've got a question from Jason Pinchback. Hello, Jason. And he's asking about nurdles. And before I read his question, just to mention that um, there's a episode of Talk Plus Water featuring Jace Tunnel, who talks about plastic pollution on the Texas coast, including nurdles. Um, and so Jason's question is, nurdles have been of interest along the Texas coast with more prevalence in concentrated areas, often closer to where they are manufactured. Did you identify any nurdles in your sample?
I did not. Um, and yeah, I know that's also a thing that I've seen in a lot of studies. That was not something I found specifically in any of mine. Grant, I was not really near the coast, and that is, I know, a big thing in coastal areas. But no, I didn't personally.
So nurdles are going to be a lot larger than the microfibers and
Mhm.
microplastics
Yeah,
that you,
most of what I found were the fibers. That was, like I said, 93% of what I found were the very small fibers.
and essentially that's coming from our clothes, I guess.
Yeah, that's primarily coming from clothes, just synthetic things, the
And I
synthetic fabrics. Yeah.
and I was told actually by Chase Tunnel that when you change your lint catcher and your dryer, that a lot of the stuff that's in there are microfibers.
Yeah.
It looks, I mean, I didn't really know what lint, I was guessing lint was something else. I don't know
Yeah.
what I thought, but a lot of that is microfibers.
And actually, I need to go back for a second. A lot of what we see in the rivers are, yes, from synthetic textiles from our clothes, but a lot of it is also from fishing lines, I should mention as well. I found a lot of fragments that were fishing lines that had frayed. But as far as your laundry, yeah, there are actually some companies that will sell cotton, basically bags to put your clothes in before you put it into the washing machine to try and trap a lot of those synthetic fibers from making it into the water system, basically to try to catch it in the bag. Of course, at some point you have to rinse that bag out. So it's still going to get into the natural system eventually. But yeah, there are actually some companies that are trying to address that.
All right. Well, I don't see any more questions, but I do have one little announcement here. We have another webinar on Monday at 11 a.m. that features the authors from the Texas Water Development Board of another recent Texas Water Journal article called Projected Reservoir Rating Curves and Their Utility for Water Planning in Texas. And so that webinar is free as well, and it's going to be held Monday at 11 a.m. And so, Rebecca, do you have any closing comments? I certainly have enjoyed your webinar, and I've learned a lot both from the webinar today and by reading the paper.
Thank you. No, just thank you guys very much for having me. And yeah, I enjoyed it. Thank you.
So this webinar recording will be on the Texas Water Journal website. Might take a few weeks, but it'll be up there with the other recordings that we have from our previous webinars. And of course, those are all free and available anytime anybody wants to go take a look at them. And so let me just say on behalf of the Water Journal, thank you for preparing this presentation and you know uh, giving us a lot of great information about microplastics and microfibers. And I'm sure this is an area where the research is really just starting in a lot of ways. I mean, I'm sure there's going to be a lot more attention on this hopefully going forward, there's going to be more attention on this issue.
All right. Well, thank you.
All right, that concludes the webinar.